Hey guys, I just want to talk a bit more about this topic of the spiritual INFJ. So not the spiritualized INFJ, but the spiritual INFJ. And why these INFJs tend to be more chill INFJs in some sense, in the words of a viewer. Partly due to a more solid and healthy self-esteem to begin with. And paradoxically why these INFJs are maybe less likely to be revolutionaries or big world change makers. I need to introduce this concept of the ego ideal. It's a psychoanalytic concept, okay? You might be familiar with the traditional topographical tripartite architecture of the psyche, first sketched by Freud, between the id, the ego, and the superego. So very broadly speaking, the id is the domain of the instinctive, of the impulses, of the drives, particularly the drive of sexuality and aggression. The superego is the realm of obligation, of moral demands, of norms, and of the inner critic, okay? That tries to control what the id does, and the ego is in the middle and is trying to regulate the relationship between all these other aspects of the psyche, all these agencies in a way. Let's not forget that this Freudian invention is extremely innovative because it calls into question the idea that we are all unified subjects, unified consciousness, right? There are at least three subjects, mini subjects inside us. Now the ego ideal is actually a fourth agency that is often, not always, but usually folded into the superego, but it's a personification of superego motivations in some sense, and it's represented by, for any individual at any particular moment, the ideal person they would like to be, they aspire to be, okay? So it changes, but it tends to maintain certain crucial basic features from person to person across life. And now the shortest answer is spiritual INFJs tend to have a kind of relaxed ego ideal, whereas non-spiritual INFJs, and that includes spiritualized INFJs who have been through the stages of adaptive submission and of solipsism, maintain a more demanding ego ideal. Now, why is it the case of spiritual INFJs that their ego ideal tends to be more relaxed? You see, it seems to be based on clinical evidence that people whose childhood has been somewhat complicated and that has affected their self-esteem, right, have somewhat disturbed egos, right? Their egos are not perfectly well structured. So one manifestation of this is they don't feel like they're worth much, or they sometimes feel like they're not worth that much, you know? We're not necessarily talking about people who have incredibly low self-esteem, but people who have self-esteem issues. The stronger your ego is, the more reliable your self-esteem. Now the thing is, if you have a strong ego, the theory posits that you're not going to unconsciously seek a very, very ambitious ego ideal necessarily, because the ego ideal arises in many ways as a compensation for the weak ego. So the person whose self-esteem is not very high, who thinks that their ego as it stands is not all that impressive, tends to compensate through fantasy activity. And that fantasy activity, which is often unconscious, not always unconscious, but often unconscious, tends to, if you like, materialize in a very, very lofty goals for the future. So in some sense, it's a way of saying, well, I'm not really great right now, but I have really, really great potential, and my goal is to eventually get to a stage where I will aim really, really high. So a very ambitious and in fact sometimes overly ambitious, unrealistic ego ideal arises as a compensation for an ego that is actually not feeling very strong. That does not arise in the case of someone who has already a pretty strong ego. And that explains why a lot of the time people who are extremely ambitious, very driven, and who are overachievers or who are just achievers, always seeking recognition, never having quite enough, are people who actually don't have a very structured ego, but they have very, very strong ego ideal. That also means that like the ego ideal, when it's in that form, is going to encourage people to actually try to really go beyond their station in a way and achieve things that other people who are a bit more well-rounded to start with, who are more chill, again in the words of that viewer that I think are quite revealing words, they're not necessarily going to feel as pulled in that direction. They might achieve great things, but if they don't, that's fine. And another viewer who identifies as spiritual in my comments section has said that. So I think she or he said, they do have ideals, of course, but it's the demands of it are not autocratic. That is to say, if they achieve them, that's great. If they don't, that's okay too. The thing is, when you have an impossibly high standard for the ego ideal, the discrepancy between that ideal and your ego station at a particular point in time is going to actually compound the sense that you're failing. So you're already starting with a self-esteem that's not very high. It might be further impacted by the fact that you feel like, well, perhaps, after all these years, I'm still pretty far away from that impossible to achieve ego ideal I set for myself as compensation for my weak ego in the first place. So there's a self-defeating mechanism that's risky there for people who are of the adaptive and solipsistic tendency. The spiritualized is slightly different and probably deserves another video because they maintain an ego ideal that's higher and more demanding usually than that of the spiritual INFJ. But they have attained lots of characteristics of the spiritual INFJ. In any case, that's your answer. That's why spiritual INFJs are often less revolutionary than spiritualized INFJs, because spiritual INFJs tend to take life as it is, whereas spiritualized INFJs have sufficiently integrated the aspects of adaptive submission and solipsism to know that they still want to aim for transcendence. In a sense, through achieving the transcendence of spiritualization, they've integrated that into their ego ideal, and that ideal continues to drive them. So let me know in the comments what you thought about this analysis. Drop me a like if you enjoyed this video. And don't forget, I've written 2 books on the INFJ personality if you want to hear more. The Infinite Soul is my latest book, INFJ Life in the Modern World. The modern world is often seen as hostile by INFJs. But this book explores how, while maintaining our authenticity, INFJs can achieve purpose, meaning, value, and a rich, significant life. So you should check the link below if you want to get the book, okay? And drop a review if you haven't yet, because it really helps with the referencing. The Ecstatic Soul is the prequel. You might be familiar with this book. Lots of reviews online to check as well at the link below. And you look at the INFJ personality. Deepest investigation of the INFJ mind, INFJ consciousness, what it's like to be an INFJ. Check it out. And as usual, the lifeblood of my channel is my Patreon page. My channel depends on your donations. Anywhere from $3.50 a month on Patreon. The link is below. You get access to bonus content. Released a video yesterday going more in depth into what the spiritual INFJ means, my particular process of reflecting around that, other topics where I go more in depth, either from my mainstream YouTube or from my books. You get access to me too if you want to suggest new content or ask me questions for clarification. Okay guys, thank you very much, and I see you next time.